Welcome everybody here today. I'm Nicole Gurran, Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning, and I'm also the Director of the Henry Halloran Research Trust here at the University of Sydney. And before we go any further today, of course, I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we're here today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and it's on their beautiful country, of course, that the University of Sydney's campuses are built, and it's also where I'm privileged to live myself as well. And while I am acknowledging country, which is a very appropriate thing to do, of course, particularly with this event, I'd also like to recognise the owners of Bundjalung country, where I grew up in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. It's been going through a lot lately in that beautiful country, and I'm very pleased that we'll be holding an event there as part of the Festival of Urbanism on Monday with the Living Lab Northern Rivers. In paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, I want to thank all of the First Nations leaders who've been working tirelessly and at great personal cost at the moment in this lead up to the referendum on an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. I'm very pleased to say that a number of schools here at the University of Sydney, including the Sydney Law School and my own school, Architecture, Design and Planning, have released statements with strong support for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. So with that said, it's my great privilege and delight actually to welcome you to this Festival of Urbanism, the 10th Festival of Urbanism now, organised by the Henry Halloran Research Trust, which, as I said, I direct. Now, the Research Trust here at the University of Sydney is a cross-disciplinary research centre, which means we bring together all of the different bodies of knowledge within the university to support new research on problems facing cities, regions and places. And the other part of our mandate is to do that through evidence-informed dialogue and engagement with government, with the profession, with industry, with community leaders and of course wider members of the public as well. And our public program of events throughout the year, but particularly this Festival of Urbanism, is one of the ways that we do that. So this year's theme of contested urbanism really gets at the heart of some of the most difficult challenges that confront us, all of us actually, who care about cities and regions. And I can't think actually of a more contested topic than country. I've been a practicing planner and researcher for more than 20 years, and over those 2 decades we've gone from awkwardly perhaps beginning to acknowledge that this country's origin story didn't begin with colonisation, to starting to appreciate that many, if not all of our assumptions about land tenure, about property, ownership, could and should be contested, along, of course, with our beliefs about cultural heritage and history, and how this history should be recognised and reflected in decisions about future development. And personally, I think we've probably used planning and property laws and processes as a way of even helping us not see. They've certainly legitimised many practices that I think in the future we are going to want to contest and change. They've helped us not see and confront very uncomfortable truths about past and, of course, ongoing injustices. And I think in part we've been reluctant to open up this conversation because we haven't known what to do about it. But as the Uluru Statement from the Heart has laid clear, it's not actually for us, certainly not people like me, to know what to do, but first to listen. And so we are absolutely privileged today to be able to listen to the speakers that we've got for you this afternoon. I'm going to hand over now to the chair of this session, Dr. Michael Mossman, in a moment, but first let me introduce him to you all. Dr. Mossman is a Kuku-Yalanji man from Cairns in far north Queensland who currently lives and works here on the country of the Gadigal people in Sydney. Michael's a lecturer, researcher and Associate Dean Indigenous at the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning, and his PhD was titled Third Space, Architecture and Indigeneity. Dr. Mossman is a registered architect and a First Nations design strategy consultant with over 20 years professional practice experience. He advocates country and First Nations issues in the architectural profession at educational, practice and policy levels. And he has done this with great generosity through his leadership at the school and the university as well. Thank you very much, Michael.
So thank you, Nicole, for your introduction, the acknowledgement of country as part of this Festival of Urbanism 2023, and also to the Henry Halloran Trust, Research Trust. So Yundu Yalada, everyone. My name is Dr. Michael Mossman. I'm a Kuku-Yalanji man. And as Nicole already said, I am a lecturer and researcher, and also the Associate Dean Indigenous at the School of Architecture, Design and Planning here at the University of Sydney. So I was born and raised in Cairns in far north Queensland, and that's the country of the Gimoy, Walabara, Yidinji peoples. The place Cairns has an original name, Gimoy, and Gimoy is the slippery blue fig that's so prominent in that place. And it's certainly a place that like many others around the Australian continent, that's encountered and still deals with the narratives of the topic of this conversation, of this session called Contested Country, from the frontier wars to contemporary heritage conservation, protest and settler memorials. So what does it all mean? Protests over environmental heritage or loss of public housing, local communities feeling disempowered, recognition of custodianship of and sovereignty over country, narratives and contesting memorials with counter-narratives. There's certainly a lot to cover. And it's a privilege to be speaking with you today in my role as the chair of this session. And we have, of course, brilliant speakers, and these are representatives from a community of practitioners who have a broad range of lived experiences and scholarship in and around the topics. So joining us today to share thoughts are Stephen Gapps, whose books, The Sydney Wars, 1788 to 1817, and Gujarat, The First Wiradjuri War of Resistance, The Bathurst War of 1822-1824, presents frontier wars for public recognition as Australia's first wars. So thank you, Stephen. Then we are joined by Ines Hauer, who's standing in today for Professor Bronwyn Carlson, who unfortunately is unable to join us today. And Ines will share thoughts on the histories of Waterloo and the planned redevelopment of the Endeavour estate. So thank you, Ines, for joining us at late notice. Then we'll be followed with Jess Herder, who's a Dungari woman who grew up on Dharawal country and now lives and works on Darug country. So Jess has over 20 years experience working with New South Wales Government in natural and cultural heritage. So thank you, Jess, for joining us. Looking forward to your talk. And then we conclude our guest speakers with Seth Diaz, who's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning. And his research focuses on spatial and urbanistic implications for First Nations protest in Sydney and the alteration of ways that practitioners in the built environment read the colonial fabric of the city. So thank you all for joining us, and the program today is quite jam-packed. We've actually carved out a little bit of time as well, but in saying that, we will be sort of operating to specific timeframes as per the program, so just really repeat that, there's very specific timeframes. And Nicole's got some numbers printed out there to count down, so just keep an eye on her and don't be too surprised. We want to do this so that we can hold a bit of space for Q&A at the end, which can further enrich the dynamism of these yarns. So each speaker will have 10 minutes to tell their stories and how their practices interact with the overarching conversation of contested country. And, as it's mentioned in the title here, from the frontier wars to contemporary heritage conservation, protest and settler memorials. So I'd like to make it clear that, again, we've got 10 minutes for guest speakers to talk, so please, all questions and discussions will occur at the end, and I will facilitate those. So we've already received a couple of questions, and we'll get to those in due course. So please sit back and get comfortable or get uncomfortable and listen carefully to these voices, to these worldviews that'll be shared with you over the next 45 minutes. Thank you. And Stephen, you will be our first speaker, so I'll hand the microphone over to you. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Bamal and Badu, the unceded lands and waters that we're gathered here today, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. Now, 10 minutes, oh dear. I want to look at 3 case studies, I suppose you call them, of contested spaces, but how they might resonate in the present. They're related to frontier wars in the Sydney region, which I've done a bit of work on. The first one is obviously a map of Sydney Harbour. This was discovered recently. I worked at the National Maritime Museum as a curator, and we were donated a logbook from one of the officers of the First Fleet. And his diaries and journals are already in State Library 100 years ago, so important. But this logbook had been sitting with the family for generations in England, and they said, here, you can have it. Logbooks are boring. The tides, charts, distances, etc. But in this was some draft charts that Bradley had done that I'd never seen before. And when I looked closely, there were some names, place names on the map that I'd never seen before. And one of them was Bloody Point. And I thought, that's interesting. I've never seen that on a map of Sydney, early colonial map of Sydney before. So I did some investigation, and of course, Bloody Point matches with Iron Cove there and Dobroyd Point. Now, you might know the Bay Run. That's where the Bay Run is, and so a lot of historians in the past have seen this event, which occurred in 1788. The death of 2 rush cutters, convict rush cutters, must have occurred at Rushcutters Bay. This nails it down to Bloody Point. At the time this was drafted in early 1788, mid-1788, this is where, in effect, what the first 2 recorded deaths of colonists at the hands of Aboriginal people occurred, here at Dobroyd Point, just where UTS Rowers Club is today. I found this out a couple of years ago. I think nothing's happened about this since, but it just makes you think, as an historian, it makes you think there is still information in the archives to discover, and that's what inspires me to continue bringing this up. And it inspires me that perhaps this can add to the way that we might see this space in the future. Now, the next example I wanted to bring up was, this is a map of Governor Macquarie's instigated 1816 campaigns across the Sydney region. Now, looking at that, when you start to map these things out, you start to see the extent. And this is the largest military campaign in the history of Sydney. You know, there was 3 major detachments, and then other parties were sent out. In particular, one, which is often disregarded, was sent to guard the Great Western Highway, because the settlement at Bathurst was so critical to Macquarie's projected future of the colony. But I guess the point I wanted to make about this was a lot of this conflict that led up to these punitive campaigns, which lead to the Appin massacre of 1816 in April, which pretty much ends the conflict, the resistance across the Sydney region. A lot of the issues for the colonists around this was that the mountains, the Blue Mountains and down to the south, were what one colonist called an advantageous retreating ground. It was so annoying to these settlers that they could raid the farms along the Nepean River on the outskirts of the colony and then just retire across the river into the mountains. And what this makes me think of, as someone who's been bushwalking the Blue Mountains for years and knows it pretty well as a wilderness space, and for someone like yourself probably, who has a school-based history of how rugged and impassable those mountains were, this made me think of the mountains as a place of safety, as a place of refuge, rather than this harsh barrier that the settlers were trying to cross. So it really flips my thinking on the mountains that surround Sydney and their relationship to the Sydney Basin. And this is just, on that mapping front, this is just the casualties that occur. Once you start to put these down and map them out over time, you really start to see the extent of the conflict that has previously often been seen as desultory or small skirmishes and guerrilla warfare. But once you map these things out, and I'm really looking forward to doing more of this, you start to see patterns. Now, I'll just finish with the third case study, which is down south of Sydney at Appin, near where the massacre occurred. And you can see in this building, which is an outbuilding, a stone granary or outbuilding, you can see this window. And if you look closely, it's got the characteristics of a gun slot or a rifle's gun loop. Now, when I started doing some digging around in the Appin area, I found 5 examples of these sorts of windows in that location. And one is at a historic homestead, and there's a 400-page conservation management plan on that homestead, and it's got 2 words about that window: possibly defensive, ? And that's it. Now, these were built after 1816, we know that, but I guess what I'm trying to work out is, were they built with this really significant conflict? I mean, the Battle of Razorback was an Aboriginal victory in 1816 before the massacre at Appin. Were they built with that memory, that settler memory of conflict? Often these kind of domestic defensive architecture elements were all around the Empire, the British Empire, and often they were multiple use. You know, they could have been for convicts, bushrangers, but we shouldn't forget also against the resistance warfare of Aboriginal people. And yeah, there's an inside view, and it's a classic rifle slit window. A lot of architectural historians say that, well, they're Georgian decorative features, you know, military elements. They're also quite handy if you're in trouble. So yeah, I thought those 3 examples, and we got 1 minute. Oh, okay. Well, I could finish early because I think that's really what I wanted to get across, that these three different case studies show in different ways this land that was contested and how we might be able to rethink it and to reevaluate those contests in the present. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was amazing commentary there. I really appreciate that. I really wanted to, just to see that sort of detail. It really does call to, really brings to the fore what, these sorts of actions that are taking place. I'll now ask Inez to please step up to the microphone. Please. Thank you, and we'll hear from your talk. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your, thank you, Michael, and thanks, Stephen. That was hugely interesting. I know that my colleague, Professor Bronwyn Carlson, was supposed to be here today, but she couldn't come, and I know she's hugely disappointed. So thank you for having me. I'm the step-in, and I have 10 minutes, so this was quite difficult. I should press this, and tēnei te mihi ki te tangata whenua, te mana whenua, te whenua moe a, te hapu Gadigal, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. I begin by acknowledging in my language of Te Reo Māori of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Indigenous language there, and I acknowledge the people of this land where we meet, and I do it in my language because Indigenous language allow for Indigenous worldviews to be expressed, and in just 2 sentences I'm able to express what I truly feel, and that is, in those 2 sentences I acknowledge the connection of Gadigal lands, peoples, skies, waters more than human, ancestors and descendants, elders gone on, elders that are here now, and elders yet to arrive. And I acknowledge the different realms of Gadigal with my acknowledgement of Gadigal existence. And I recognise that Gadigal knowledges and spirits remain and flow underneath all of these roads and buildings and sandstone buildings. And I'm grateful to be here. And it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So when I was informed of the festival, yesterday, I was quite excited actually because my background research is, I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Indigenous Studies and I'm a lecturer there, but my research is Indigenous diaspora, and it was good to hear that this was interdisciplinary because I was thinking, there's going to be lots of heritage and planning, but anyway, I'll explain my story and my research now. So, and specifically I'm looking at Māori in Australia because one of 6 Māori in Australia live here. That's a lot. There's a lot about culture. But in my master's research, I came across this little whare. And so when I was told about the festival and these ideas of contested country and what this statement can entail when we think about contests of ideas and values, and especially when we think about whose voices are heard, whose are muted, and further, who is visible, and whose presences are made invisible. So this little whare, or this little house, was the centrepiece of my master's research, which led me down a research path of historical urban development, which I'm speaking today. It does have some relevance to current, it does have some relevance today, absolutely. So, but I'll go through the story first so that you can see. Some of you might know where this little house is. Those of you who are local to USyd or Gadigal country might recognise, but those of you who don't, if we pan out from here, we can see that It's in an urban area and sits next to a building. It's behind the little whare's behind that tree called Tūranga. And if we pan out again, Tūranga is a ginormous building. You might recognise it now. The building Tūranga is 29 floors of apartment housing. And if you pan out again, it's one of two buildings of the Twin Towers in Waterloo, which is just down the road here. Tūranga has a twin tower called Matawai, and they were both part of a housing project or estate called the Endeavour project, and they were finished. Construction was finished in 1976. The little whare, the little Māori house I presented in the beginning, was part of a decorative theme that was inscribed into the whole estate, into the Endeavour estate. I discuss the Endeavour estate because to me it's a place of layers where the voices of those who resided and lived there, those whose homes were made there, those who raised families there, I believe have never been listened to. And in the process, their voices and their presences have not only been ignored, but they have been muted and replaced with others. In this place and space in Waterloo, I think I'm going to run out of time, it starts with the invasion and colonisation of Gadigal country, a thriving peoples and lands that were near decimated by colonial expansion. Thousands of generations resided in this place prior to invasion. And then Waterloo and its surrounding areas of Redfern and South Sydney became a hub for Gadigal community who were forced off some of their lands in and around Warrain, or what we now know as Sydney Cove. How much time? Okay, cool. And as industry, including the railway works, were established in Redfern by around about the 1960s, I know I'm taking a big jump, but Waterloo became a community of working families, immigrants, and a growing population of Indigenous peoples and families, diasporic Aboriginal mobs, joining their kin in this place. By the 1960s and 1970s, Redfern and Waterloo screamed its unwantedness by its appearance and its militant, radical black and impoverished residents. There's a whole lot of other factors that are involved here, and with the amalgamation of other political and social forces, by 1972, with no prior consultation or warning, the New South Wales Housing Commission sent Waterloo residents a proclamation stating that their homes had been gazetted for resumption and acquisition, which meant that everybody had to leave and they were raising their homes. In spite of protests, the Endeavour project went ahead and the estate was constructed. The Twin Towers were initially built to house elderly New South Wales residents and was designed as an enormous tribute to James Cook, as you can see here, which is not necessarily that unusual. Australia has spent more than 250 years not just idolising the myth of Cook, but also the vessel that he came in. However, as I go on to explain, the estate was a whole other level of immortalisation and commemoration. The Twin Towers were 29 floors of apartments. Each floor had a common room for residents to socialise and foster community. Each of these communal rooms were decorated with a place that Cook had been to. There were 58 floors between the two buildings that were featured in Cook's exploration and discoveries. And these are bolded with asterisks. All of these places are Indigenous lands. Global Indigenous countries with global Indigenous peoples attached to them. The New South Wales Housing Commission and its employees decorated each room with their visions and imaginations of all of these peoples and places. 5 minutes to go. And just quickly, some of the New South Wales Housing Commission employees took leave from their day-to-day jobs to go and decorate these rooms. And Yeah, so they made, for instance, in Quebec, or some of the places in what we now know as Canada, they erected totem poles and a whole heap of other imaginations. The Endeavour Estate is a site of contested countries, figuratively, metaphorically, symbolically, and literally. It is a site of colonial imaginations of diverse global Indigenous lands and their peoples, permanently inscribing these imaginations, stereotypes, misconceptions of indigeneity, all the while on Gadigal land. Gadigal peoples were invisibilised and replaced with imagined global Indigenous identities. Voices were muted, specific voices were remembered, commemorated and idolised, while some voices were specifically and deliberately forgotten. My account of the Endeavour Estate is a snapshot of history. There's so much more to this, but the Endeavour Estate is now a site proposed for more redevelopment, and this redevelopment is the same story at just another time. The same story, same history of the site since invasion. People will be removed from these towers with no option, displaced and replaced with other homes and other people. This place is a place of removing peoples from their homes and not creating homes. And there are specific voices that are not heard and specific voices who have all the power still, 250 years later. And on that note, I know I've got a little bit of time, but...
Thank you, Inez. I think that's a really fascinating study there, and to know the communal rooms and the actual meanings and of these places that they're named after is, amazing to see that. I'm going to call on Jess Herder to please step forward. Thank you, Jess.
Yeah, why everyone? As Michael mentioned, I'm a Dungari woman. I grew up on Dharawal country and I now live and work on Darug land. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal country today. And the reason that I'm not on Dungari country is because my great-grandmother, who's pictured here, is a stolen generation survivor. So she was taken from her home on the mid-north coast of New South Wales to Cootamundra Girls' Home in southwest New South Wales. She was trained as a domestic servant, and then she worked as a domestic servant for a doctor here in Sydney, and that's how my family have ended up here in Sydney. And so dispossession and displacement certainly has impacted our family's connection to country. And when I started working in planning in 2017, this was kind of front of mind, the connection between planning and dispossession, and stumbled across this quote from Aileen Morton Robinson, a Murray woman from Queensland. So she says that in Australia, the sense of belonging, home and place enjoyed by the non-Indigenous subject, the coloniser or the migrant, is based on the dispossession of the original owners and the land, the original owners of the land, and the denial of our rights under international customary law. It is a sense of belonging derived from ownership as understood within the logic of capital, and it mobilises the legend of the pioneer or the battler in its self-legitimisation. Against this stands the Indigenous sense of belonging, home and place in its incommensurable difference. So in 2021, I started working for the Western Parkland City Authority, and among many other things that they're working on, one of them is delivering the new city centre next to the Western Sydney International Airport that's being built. And the city centre is going to be named after John Bradfield. So I was curious, who is John Bradfield? What did he do? So December 1867, he was born. And in 1891, he started work for New South Wales Department of Public Works. In 1906, my great-grandmother was born. In 1909, the Aborigines Protection Act was brought in, and at this point in time, one of the main purposes of the Act was to enable the displacement of Aboriginal people out of towns, out of cities, into missions and reserves and stations. In 1912, Cootamundra Domestic Training Home for Aboriginal Girls is established, where my grandmother was later sent. In 1913, construction starts on Canberra, and this is important because Bradfield City Centre is often compared to Canberra as being the first city centre to be built in Australia since Canberra. In 1915, there's an important amendment to the Aborigines Protection Act, which enables any Aboriginal child to be taken at any point in time for any reason simply based on their race. And it's after that amendment to the Act that my great-grandmother is taken. In 1924, Bradfield is the first recipient of an engineering doctorate from University of Sydney, of all places, and passes in 1943. The Aborigines Protection Act is not repealed in New South Wales until 1969. So when I think about Aboriginal perspectives of planning and how we were kept out of those decisions, we were kept out of the cities, we were kept out of the towns for all that time that Bradfield was making history. I think of this quote from Song of the Crocodile by Nardi Simpson, and although this is a fictional story, it's written by an Aboriginal woman about Aboriginal perspectives. And so the children are in class learning about infrastructure, and there's this thought from an Aboriginal student that for the girls living in the campground, the railways and the roads, the postmaster and the station master, the local member of parliament and the silos, each working party and their endless meetings and constant planning all blurred into a single dreary tale of progress and triumph, the only enemy being the heat or the scrub or the distance or the rain. It was the story of hollow heroes blinded by their own importance. And so I imagine many Aboriginal people would consider Bradfield one of those hollow heroes, and that in Western Sydney we're still trying to overcome the heat and the distance and the rain. So it makes you wonder, this book was set in 1950s, what's changed? But in fact, many things have changed, and for the better, in my opinion. So there's a lot more people involved in making sure that First Nations people are considered, their voices are heard, and we have lots of documents now that help guide this work. So we've got the recognised country guidelines for the Erythropolis in Western Sydney that help with the planning side of things. The government architects, Dylan Combermary and Dr. Danielle Cromrick, have done a lot of work on the Connecting with Country framework, which helps with the design of things. We've got the Aboriginal procurement policy, making sure that we're procuring from Aboriginal businesses, Aboriginal people are employed, they're participating, they're getting training. The Western Parkland City Authority is one of many organisations that has a reconciliation action plan. We also have land rights. The New South Wales Aboriginal Land Rights Act and myself both turned 40 this year. And so Gunungara Local Aboriginal Land Council is the land council responsible for the Bradfield City Centre site in terms of it sits within their boundaries, and they have a community land and business plan that spells out their aspirations for their land. And then acknowledging that that land rights system that came in 83, that statutory authority overlays the cultural authority that the traditional custodians have for that country. And so the Western Parkland City Authority also established the Koori Perspective Circle, which is their local voices, local Aboriginal advisory group, that are made up of different community members, so not just the land rights system, not just traditional custodians, but other people that live in Western Sydney. So what have I learnt on my journey the last 6 years across planning? In 2019, when I did my grad cert here in urban and regional planning, I found Arnstein's Ladder of Citizen Participation, which was written in '69, and I couldn't believe that a paper with such amazing ideas was written so long ago, and we were only just kind of catching up in terms of co-design with communities. And it's also interesting that it was written in '69 because that's when the Aboriginals Protection Act was finally repealed. But, we're not just about making sure that people's rights are respected. We're about trying to redistribute power and address that power imbalance that exists. And I acknowledge that the Queer Perspective Circle aren't a decision-making body. We're not redistributing that power yet, but we're building the relationships that we can hopefully build on to then have that in the future. And so the work becomes about relationships and about resources, and then trying to make sure that you're not promising too much, and that you can do with the resources what you want to do. And so then, what are we doing? I feel like it actually fits the definition of reconciliation. If you look at Reconciliation Australia's website, reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous peoples for the benefit of all Australians. Australia's colonial history is characterised by devastating land dispossession, violence and racism. Over the last half century, however, many significant steps towards reconciliation have been taken. Reconciliation is an ongoing journey that reminds us that while generations of Australians have fought hard for meaningful change, future gains are likely to take just as much, if not more, effort. And so certainly over the next decade or so that the city is built, this is going to be an ongoing journey between the Aboriginal community and the Western Parkland City Authority. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jess. So that was a really fascinating presentation, and certainly the context of knowing our family histories and for others to know that as well is very important. I'm going to now call on Seth Diaz, please. He's our final guest speaker for today, so please, Seth. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Seth. I'm a recently resumed PhD candidate here at the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning. And before I move on, I'd also just like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Gadigal country today, and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to thank all the other speakers for your contributions, and to say it's quite an honour to be up here next to you guys. My PhD work is focusing on the spatial dimensions of First Nations protest in Sydney and the ramifications of these historical events for urban discourse and how we sort of think about the city in general. So as this audience I think would be well familiar with, there's a long and deeply tragic history of violent dispossession during the colonisation of this country, a process that is ongoing despite the recent comments of a certain senator from the Northern Territory. But for as long as this colonial program has pillaged and destroyed this country, there's also been a history of very brave resistance to it from that very first day, and I think Stephen's book really goes into that in detail. From the earliest days of invasion, people have resisted, whether that be Pemulwuy's insurgency or any of the countless acts that we will never know about because of the choices of early colonial historians to not tell those stories. This resistance has continued right up to the modern day, but of course, as colonial society developed and progressed, as have the strategies of protest and contention by Indigenous activists. In the mid-20th century, we see the dawn of what is described by many historians as the dawn of the contemporary wave of Indigenous protest. People may have seen this picture before, but it's from the 1938 Day of Mourning protest in Sydney. This is viewed by historians as the start of the current wave of Indigenous protest, and specifically this is because of the change in protest tactics that this event represents. As the 19th century closed and we moved into the 20th, we see across the world, we see civil disobedience change form and move towards rallies and protests as a very prominent way to express discontent around a certain issue. Global events such as revolutions and protests during the Great Depression really contributed to this. And by the 30s, we really start to see this shift towards protest processions as a prominent form of expressing discontent within a social movement. So in 1938, we have about 100 First Nations people. They chose to march through the city from Sydney Town Hall to an unassuming small building on Elizabeth Street called the Australian Hall. And this is where they're standing outside in this picture. You might think 100 people protesting, that's really not that big a deal, but if you consider where Australian society was at the time, this is the 30s, they were actually doing this on the 26th of January in 1938, which was the 150th anniversary of the Australian colonial project. And if you consider that Australia is still grappling with its racist past, you can only imagine what it would have been like for these people to protest in this way in 1938. My work, it focuses on these protest events because through these events, there's one way we can start to see spatial identity developed in the city that specifically represents Indigenous or indigeneity or resistance. This spatial identity, as I'll get into, is long-lasting and it has many ramifications for the way urban space is perceived and experienced. Moreover, it has ramifications for how we as experts in the field, can understand the development of spatial identity in the inner core or the imperial core of Sydney. So to explain all that using the 1938 example, they ended their march at Australian Hall. As I said, there's nothing really architecturally remarkable about the Australian Hall. And I say that, I recognise I'm saying that to a room full of people who might disagree with me, but more importantly, there's never really been anything at Australian Hall to visually represent Indigenous culture. There's no mural or other design choice or something like that. Regardless of this, the intangible value of the building led the organisers of the cataclysmic 1988 protest demonstration. So 50 years later, we're now at the bicentennial protest, which was against the 200th birthday of the colonial project. They chose to stop outside the Australian Hall, have a speech, and then they chose to end their procession immediately across the road in South Hyde Park. This was because of the history of what happened there in 1938. They made that explicit choice to honour that moment in time and chose to stop there. And that was just thanks to the acts of these people. Fast forward to modern times, and many of the yearly Invasion Day protests still stop outside the Australian Hall, and they have a speech there, and they remember and they commemorate the history of that location. This is what I mean when I explain that there's layered spatial identity in this place, something that still exists today. So this is 80 years on. That's the Australian Hall in the background. Make up your own mind if you think there's anything remarkable about it. And this is Nathan Moran. He's the CEO of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, and he's addressing an Invasion Day protest in 2019, I want to say, maybe 2020. They'll see the Aboriginal Land Council now own and operate in the Australian Hall, and they bought it because of this history, because of what it meant. It's also now on the State Heritage Registry, again, due to this history. So that's the first part of what my research examines, how layered spatial identity, so layers built up from these moments in time to create meaning in certain locations of the city for Indigenous people. Something that happens through the act of protesting, a phenomena that, while not visible or tangible, shows that there's still the ability to develop deep historical value to First Nations people in the inner city, the imperial city. A type of spatial value that I think our field is only just starting to grapple with, this idea of intangible heritage, or however you want to describe it. But secondarily, I'm looking at the way protest processions actually subvert and respond to the existing ideological markers in the city. And in doing so, they contest their natural function. As has already been covered, I think, by some of the other speakers, the city is littered with these markers of colonial ideology. I sort of argue that the natural meaning of these places is subverted, and the ideological marker is denaturalised. It has this natural function, which is to express this symbolic ideological perspective, and by protesting near it, we can subvert that meaning. So this image here is during a deaths in custody protest outside that chose to end at the Supreme Court of New South Wales. The Supreme Court is embedded in the inner core of the colony. Right up the road is New South Wales Parliament House. Across from the Supreme Court is St James Church, and you also have Hyde Park Barracks right there. I think this image just sort of wonderfully shows this idea of subverting the meaning. The courts obviously have this inherent ideological symbolism that can then be contested during a protest event, and this creates new meaning for the protest group when they do this, and that can lead to layered spatial identity. This can, however, go both ways. In more recent times, protests have actually shifted away from colonial markers in the city in certain instances. And this is because of the traumatic memory that could be attached to these ideological markers. So in 2020, Black Lives Matter protests actually shifted out of Hyde Park and away from some of these ideological markers, like the infamous statue of Captain Cook. And this was because, and I worked closely with some of the protest organisers of those Black Lives Matter protests, and this was because of the inherent trauma that these markers were bringing up. There was also, at the same time, a rediscovery of the Gadigal word for the domain, which was Jabbergali, so they chose to actually move their protests into Jabbergali. Yeah, I guess this just shows that, this can go both ways, and that Indigenous political actors, they were just tired of marching next to the Cook statue while police were there, maybe trying to arrest them, chase them. This photo was actually taken by my partner while we were, trying to run away from the police who were arresting people at Black Lives Matter protests. And I guess this brings me to my closing point. As architects, historians, heritage experts, planners, whatever, we have to constantly be critical of who we are valorising through built form and why we are doing that. The social experiences of First Nation protesters shows that layered spatial identity can be formed in alternate ways within the colonial city, but we should recognise that design choices over whose history is set in stone has far-reaching implications for the city and how it's read, perceived and experienced. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. That was a really fabulous group of presentations. So thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for really listening and participating in that way. What we're going to do now is invite our guest speakers up to the dais, please, and please take a seat facing towards the audience. This is a stage. We've actually carved out a bit more time in order for us to have more questions for our guest speakers to be able to elaborate on from you. And so I wanted to really open that up. Nicole here has the microphone and will diligently move around the space to activate the questions along. So another microphone there. So if there is a question immediately, we will go to the audience. There's one right there. Thank you.
Hi. I was just wondering, so I've just finished year 12 and I've done a bit of, my history extension major work was on counter-memorialisation of Ben Boyd in particular. And I was just wondering, when we look at counter-memorialisation as a practice in the settler landscape, how do we mass mobilise that? So how do we kind of get people across Australia and in our, local settings and things like that to really get on board and counter-memorialise, really? Do you have any suggestions on how we can practically do that?
I would suggest maybe, Seth, would you like to have a go at answering that one?
Yeah, great question. And I mean, such an important topic to look at. And thanks for asking that question. I guess to me, it's just a matter of these memorials and their construction go hand in hand with the idea behind them and that idea gaining popularity. So in the instance, I think you said the memorialisation of Pemulwuy, right? So it's like...
Ben Boyd, the counter-memorialisation.
Oh, of course, yeah. So I guess just in general, how can we make sure that these ideas that need to be known by all of settler society are sent as far and wide as possible? And that's such a difficult thing to actually do. But I think it starts with having events like this where we can actually breathe life into this idea of counter-memorialising and, have these conversations and then go away and, talk to others about it. But yeah. No.
I think providing space for truth-telling is really important. In the point of Ben Boyd, nobody knows the truth about why the name was to be immortalised. Like there's a story that wasn't told, and I think it's really important that those stories are told so that people understand why we want change.
And I'll just add, in my experience, I've often been surprised that not everyone agrees with counter-memorialisation in different situations and circumstances and locations. And I'm not sure about it in general, and sometimes I just want to tear down monuments and throw them in the bin. Sometimes I want to put them in a museum. And at other times I increasingly think, depending on the situation, but for example, where I've thought that perhaps a counter-memorialisation process should go on, and I'm thinking of Bathurst. I don't know if you know Bathurst, but it has some pretty serious war memorials, about 36 of them, and no Bathurst War memorials at all, but one statue to George Evans that has an Aboriginal guy kneeling below him. And it's like, oh my God, rip it down. But the local Wiradjuri community don't really care about that. They would rather see some kind of commemorative garden or native garden as an alternative.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah. So I guess my point is that I think it's really important to ask community for what type of counter-memorial process or not should go on.
So we'll come back to you.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
We have a question from the lady here.
It was sort of a follow-up to the really great question over here, and it was just to say that after the Charlestown protests, where they wanted to remove a Confederate statue, and that triggered deaths, which was horrible in America, the US National Trust, which is the US, I think they call it the Preservation Trust over there, released quite quickly a toolkit for local communities on dealing with these Confederate statues. I suspect they had it in preparation well in advance, given how quickly they put it out. But it's a really fantastic toolkit. But one of its main things is they can't have a policy nationwide. It's such a personal thing that just like you said, starting at community level and working locally on each of these, because every community is going to respond differently to how they want it dealt with, and depending on where they are at their own reconciliation journey as well in that area.
Thank you for that. What I would just say is that with the case of Ben Boyd, I think that the counter-memorialisation is really interesting because there was a lot of pushback to it, and I think that it's very important to consider the methodology of it as well, because when you're looking at counter-memorialisation, there's really two approaches where you can either completely tear it down or you can add, say, for instance, in Neutral Bay, I think that they're adding a third counter-memorial plaque which contextualises the other two, and that's about sharing that story and saying, yes, you can see that there is acknowledgement, and tell me if I'm just yabbering on a bit too much, but there's acknowledgement of that existence, that he was he was memorialised, because we don't want to completely erase that, because you want to acknowledge the fact that people were hurt by that memorialisation. Because if we just get rid of it, then it's kind of saying, oh, hey, look, we've never memorialised anyone, we're a happy country. But if we add counter-memorialisation that contextualises the memorialisation and tells the truth, then I think that's really important. And that kind of leads me on to just ask, with memorialising frontier conflict, I was just like, I'd be interested to hear what your kind of perspectives on how that could exist in our landscape, because obviously we don't want to adhere to colonial and Western standards of memorialisation, because that just doesn't apply to Indigenous people. So yeah, if anyone has thoughts on that, I'd be interested to hear.
Well, if I could just quickly respond to that. There's a huge discussion that could go on about this. Thank you. But just a point, I think, firstly, we have to get the Australian War Memorial to respond to these issues first. And then everything can unfold after that. Yeah.
I might shift the conversation from the live audience to a question that we received prior to the event. It was a question about how do we ensure Indigenous people design and curate the stories that need to be told from an Indigenous perspective without interference from non-Indigenous stakeholders. I think maybe if there's we could go to perhaps Jess as a sort of first response, and then maybe to you, Inez.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, as I mentioned in my presentation, there's the Connecting with Country framework, which I think would really help guide that process. But yeah, definitely making sure that you're providing the space for community to have their say in a safe way where there isn't that interruption from non-Aboriginal people. And then I guess it's about upholding the integrity of the process that you've just been through and making sure that it's not interfered with. Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, everything starts with education and conversations, but how do you uphold these conversations without non-Indigenous or settler sort of interventions or interruptions? And when they have the spaces where people will come, and universities, and we're in these institutions, right? Spaces like this and a place where we can, well, not me, but where stories can be shared are really important. But I think you're right. It's a difficult one to sort of think about coming from a settler Western institution where my voice is heard, but it's still, and Indigenous peoples across the road, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples too, but you're still sort of quietened sometimes. So I don't know if that's helpful to answer the question, but yeah. But we're working on it, chipping away. We've got an Indigenous Studies Department at Macquarie and stuff like that. So.
Thank you. Seth, you were going to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have much to add beyond what you guys have said. Just to say that I think, in general, the way we do community consultation in New South Wales in particular has its flaws these days, and I think that gets much worse when it's maybe specifically for Indigenous people. So I think thinking about how we can maybe reform or work on that is a good place to start. The Connecting with Country framework, I think, is a great place to really start that conversation. Yeah.
We have a question there. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I guess I'm coming from a different perspective on that. I'm writing a family history, and a lot of my ancestors were colonial ancestors who got some very early land grants in Sydney, so they were clearly displacing the Indigenous people. I want to tell the truth. I want to tell an honest story about how that happened. But of course, and I was interested in something Stephen said about, new material coming up in archives. That Indigenous voice just isn't there. I mean, it is the record of the invaders. Do you have any advice on how I can do a sort of respectful job of writing my family's history from my perspective, but acknowledging what happened and how it happened?
Well, just some advice. Just congratulations or thank you for actually thinking about that, firstly. That's a huge step. I think it would be great if you can connect with your local community and ask for, to talk to people about it, and you might be surprised. And it's a shared relationship too, because some of the work that I've done, finding historical documents and giving them back to community is making a better shared story, and there's an exchange going on as well sometimes. But being open to that is the first step, and the most important step, and I congratulate you for that.
I read my mind. That's what I was going to advise.
I think too, it's about not just establishing relationships and not just exchange either, and thinking about sharing stories, isn't maybe sharing back the story, but also ways that you can reciprocate beyond what you need to find out from what stories that. And some of these stories might involve a lot of trauma and stuff, so historical stories. So there's, I'm not trying to put you off, and congratulations, but it's difficult because I think it's more about I think it perhaps when researching, and I'm a settler, I'm Indigenous, but I'm a settler, researching Indigenous, it's about making a relationship before anything else follows after that, right? And what that significant relationship can mean prior to any kind of information or stories that you might want to find out.
Hi. I work in building conservation, and I recognised... I work in building conservation, and I recognise the windows from a place I've worked on in the Appin region. Might not have been the same place, but I guess from an architectural point of view, we're focusing on the sort of technical aspects of building conservation, and it never really occurred to me that what the openings were for, but now it all makes sense. It's a little bit like Rottnest Island, like you just go there for a nice holiday and you see the layers of actually what's happened after a while. So I guess from an architectural point of view, we want to be able to express the history somehow and not necessarily celebrate it all the time, because I know with the building in Elizabeth Street, I'm sure there's reasons for celebration and there's also reasons for a sort of commemoration. Or so how can we teach architects basically to understand the layers and move forward?
I'm not sure I can answer that question, but I'll try. No, I can't answer that question, how you can teach architects that, but I think there's a huge project in heritage in general that needs to reconsider colonial heritage architecture. This is what I've been doing with historical records, going back to them and rewriting the history of Sydney with a different lens. And I think that needs to be done with colonial architecture and all those colonial mansions that we've preserved as state heritage listed, but they all of them hold other elements the stories that we haven't been telling. So I don't know how you can do that, but I guess it's about developing faculties and programs and education in general.
I'd say if there's a process of asking first, to recognise that there's nuances to the stories that people understand and have connections with, and if there may be the commentary about that there's direct opposition to a particular item in the landscape, or it's something that you want to create a dialogue about. But it's the interactions with the stakeholders that can be very compelling, and it's like talking to everyone is a really important step as part of that process. We have 5 minutes to go. We'd like to really hear if there's any more questions. Be fantastic. We've got one right here. Thank you.
Not a question so much, but just listening to the conversation, I thought some of you might be interested to have a look at the video which is available online, about the creation of the Bachelor Warriors Memorial in Maryborough in Queensland. It was just unveiled in April this year. And it's important because it's a memorial to Aboriginal warriors who lost their lives defending their land, but also important because the creation of it, which was led by Aboriginal elder Glenn Miller, was really an important exercise in reconciliation. I actually went to the launch, and the range of people who participated in the launch and were there to be part of it from that local community was very, very heartwarming. And certainly as a story, it's quite an interesting one to look at.
We'll grab a quick question from over there, please.
There's one in the back row.
We'll go to the one in the back row first, please.
Hi, thank you so much for all of your excellent talks. One thing I wanted to ask, since so many of us are sort of researchers or planning, in the planning profession and whatnot here, I wanted to get your perspectives on how we can best support you in helping to, do all of the various sort of work that you're all doing here.
I think that's directed at you, Jess.
Or you might. Maybe you. No?
I've got my glasses on, but that's Rebecca down the back. Yeah. You're doing a fabulous job. Honestly, having the space to vent the frustrations of what the blockages are, and then having people listen to that and then find ways to communicate that to a broader audience that might be able to help somehow. You're doing a fabulous job already. I really appreciate everything that you guys have done.
I think I just want to say something quickly. From a scholarly perspective, cite Indigenous writers all the time. There's, before you think about settler or non-Indigenous thinkers, there are usually Indigenous thinkers that are writing about these things that people don't know about, or not saying people don't know about, that possibly haven't come across. Cite them, the more you cite, the more other people will see. Students, whoever you're teaching and stuff, can teach Indigenous scholarship, and that will go a long way too.
I'd quickly add as well that with more and more involvement, as Jess had presented in her talk, of these conversations come into the picture, or these topics come into the picture, and that it's not, and I think the role or the positions that can be taken is that it doesn't always have to be the Aboriginal person, who's raising these issues. So that really does make a big contribution if everyone is really contributing. We've got a question from Jeff.
Yeah, Stephen, you mentioned finding out on an old map a name that you didn't recognise, and I guess it's those place names that also are important in that memorialisation in terms of what gets recognised and what doesn't. And as people were talking earlier on, I was thinking of sort of travelling around the state and seeing things like Poison Waterhole Creek and other things which clearly have a history that hasn't been told. And I'm just wondering to what extent in the memorialisation conversation does actually changing the names or recognising what's behind some of those names become important?
Yeah, I think they're interlinked, aren't they? There's a lot of work in dual naming and recognition and changing names going on that is not necessarily about monuments and statues, but it's a similar thing in many ways. I also think it's really important to listen to the historical archive for Indigenous names that are there. And I've been surprised by, for example, Charles Throsby, 1810s, he goes to Bathurst, and he is told by the Surveyor General to mark down the name and ask people where every day he is, because he can't survey, right? So they use Aboriginal people's place names as a survey marking point. So that the next person that goes back there can just ask the locals, where is X, and it's a marker point. So there's a surprising amount of names and places recorded by that early colonial surveying method, and I think recognising those in that place naming mix is important too.
I think that brings an end to this discussion, to this event. Some amazing food for thought for everyone to take away. Thank you for joining us in this discussion. Please thank our guest presenters.